Hello and welcome here on my channel Wolf-Aqua, your channel about horticulture, aquaponics and aquaculture. And today I'm going to show you the second episode of Aquaponic, my story. And this episode deals about how I brought my fish over the winter time and what I did during the season 2012 and how I improved my system. Furthermore, as the last time, at the end of the video there will be a small section with learnings that I collected during the season, and let's go! At the end of the last season, most of my fish didn't make it to a decent table size. Maybe just one of my female Tiger Tilapia that I put earlier in the outdoor system, but finally, I didn't harvest any fish of my first aquaponic season. Instead, I brought them over the winter time in my indoor section. Over the winter time, I had some herbs and green lilies growing in my systems, and they did quite well. My red tilapia started soon to dig a hole in the ground for mating. The pipework did a great job as shelter for the females in case the male was chasing them. And after a while I got my first offspring of tilapia. They were born on the 1st of October 2011. Unfortunately, I had two dead fish in one of my indoor systems. The water temperature dropped to 15 degrees Celsius in one of the nights, even with heating. And for this too, it was sadly too cold. All the others were still fine and did a good job over the winter time. With increasing size, it became clear that my offspring was a breed between a red and a natural colored tilapia. The result is called a Tiger Tilapia, and they kept on growing very nicely. Furthermore, I got another time offspring, but that time pure red ones. The lilies in the indoor grow bed kept on doing well, and the next season, 2012, was about to start. That year I used a mix of expanded clay pebbles and cocoa. The tomato strain I had the season before was not very tasty for me and my family. That's why I moved to small cherry tomatoes with the hope of better flavor. While the plants were growing inside, I started to reconstruct the outdoor system and tried to implement the learnings from the last year. I tried to insulate the fish tank a bit with styrofoam and dragged the plant section more to the front to improve the light conditions. And wherever it was possible, I used pipes instead of hoses. And this is how it looked. I used two pumps, one for the plant loop, which was regulated with a time switch for 7 floodings a day, and one for the fish loop running 24/7 to ensure good water quality for the fish. The black box in the front was an attempt of a solar heating system. And now we follow the flow of the water to the plants. The inlets had a shower head of a water can where I made the holes bigger to allow better water flow. I used the shower heads to have a better gas exchange. And to prevent splashing of water over my plants, I placed the shower heads in a 100mm or 4-inch pipe. The ready-to-use grow bed looked like this. For the outlet I used a so-called drain hole method, and I did that to have water flowing back to the sump from the first minute the flooding starts, just as a safety measure to prevent that my pumps were running dry. However, the pump was so strong that there was no problem to flood the whole bed within a few minutes. And even if the pump would have been constantly on, for whatever reason, the 50mm or 2-inch pipe would have been big enough to prevent an overflow of the grow beds. Furthermore, the outlets were surrounded by a 4-inch pipe to prevent clogging. And from there, the water went back to the sump. The fish loop looked like this, from the sump in the fish tank. Also here was a shower head with big and small holes. The big ones were for transferring more kinetic energy to the water, and the small ones to create a larger surface area to allow again gas exchange. The fish tank then flowed over through a solid lift overflow. What is a pipe that goes to the bottom of the fish tank, while the actual outlet is in the upper quarter of the tank. From there the water went over my mechanical filter, what was a 300 micron stainless steel mesh to catch out the solids from the fish. Over the season I optimized that filter. After the mechanical filter came the biofilter, which was a 300-liter rainwater barrel that I filled partially with this biofilter media. Initially I wanted to make a moving bed biofilm reactor, but soon I noticed that my air pump was not strong enough to keep the whole media in suspension. That's why I decided to fill up my barrel with clay pebbles. The water fell from the mechanical filter into the standpipe in the middle of the biofilter, and from there it raced from the bottom to the top and back to the sump. This type of biofilter is called a fixed bed. At the beginning of May, the time was right to bring out the first plants. I don't want it to damage the roots of my plants, and that's why I put the plants with the pot into the bed. And that worked out quite well. The Tiger Tilapias already reached a nice size, and also the other fishes could gain quite some weight over the winter time. With my strongest tiger male, I wanted to keep breeding, but after I placed it to the females, it became very weak and almost died. I don't know what happened, but in the end I decided to stop the suffering. He had almost a pound of weight and tasted very good. Meanwhile, the plants grew very well. Here are some pictures of the peppers, tomatoes, physalis, kohlrabi and some herbs. Quite early, the tomatoes flowered and started to produce fruits. Also, in this season I grew next to my aquaponic system a kind of raspberry and blueberries. I was very happy with the water treatment of the system. The water was crystal clear and the fish were very happy. It was even possible to hand feed them with the algae that I catched out of my sump tank. The plants do well, and here we see some kohlrabi and physalis plants. Over the season I constantly tried to optimize my system. For example, here's an attempt to increase the contact time of air bubbles that got pushed down the tube. The idea was that the incoming water from the biofilter pushes down the smallest bubbles and even out of the tube at the bottom. And it worked. However, I was not able to quantify an effect because I had not the right test equipment. With an ever-increasing feeding load, the tomatoes grew very well and overgrew even the pepper plants, and the first fruits appeared. Here a flower of a pepper plant and some shots from a bird perspective. And also the physalis showed the first flowers. The mechanical filtration worked very well. What I really liked about it was that it enabled you to read the filter. For example, how many feed pellets were not eaten or if there were eggs from tilapia. However, I also noticed that when I fed my fish with algae or with duckweed, they got kind of a diarrhea. The tomatoes and physalis performed very well that year. Though I have to mention that I utilized chelated iron and calcium hydroxide to add nutrients and to buffer the pH. I guess that explains to some extent the strong fruit set of the tomatoes. In the meantime, the duckweed took over the sump. It covered it so well that the algae below the water surface had no chance to grow anymore. And as in any garden, this is also important in an aquaponic garden to do maintenance work on the plants. Especially tomatoes need quite some attention, but in the end the work gets paid off with tasty fruits. The physalis got more and more out of control and overgrew almost all plants in that bed. Oh, by the way, in the background you can see a pendule feeding device that worked pretty well for my tilapia. Also, the tomatoes dominated my pepper plants quite some, but they still managed to develop some fruits. The more exposed location of my plants gave on one hand more sunlight, but on the other hand also less protection against rain and other harsh weather conditions. That's why quite some of my plants got a brown fungus. And even towards the end of the season, with the highest feeding load, the water quality remained crystal clear. Here are some impressions of the system at the peak of the season. In fact, the cherry tomatoes tasted us way better compared to the big ones last year. Actually, we got flooded with cherry tomatoes that year. This is a shot made at the end of September where the water temperatures got already much colder. That's why the fishies acted very calmly. And then the day of the fish harvest came along. Preparation is key and you should have a net, a sharp knife, kind of a solid stick to numb the fish and a bucket of ice water. Not an easy day for me after taking care for such a long time. The Tiger Tilapias managed to grow up to a good size and the biggest one had 800 gram plus. On the day exact, they were 1 year old. Also, the Tilapia Maria put up quite some weight, but by far not as much as the Nile Tilapias. However, it is a very pretty fish. The majority of my fish harvest got smoked by me, or I gave them to my neighbors to try out their specialty. I mean, who can say that he had aquaponic tilapia? The smoked tilapia was for me a real delicacy and served us quite some meals and dinners together with tomatoes. When the fish were already all harvested, I kept the plant loop running because quite some fruits were not ripe yet. Unfortunately, the physalis never gave even one ripe fruit under our climate conditions. At the very end of the season, I stripped off all the leaves of the tomato plants, and I think even then it looked like an impressive harvest. Though my pepper plants stayed rather small. A phenomenon that I noticed is that when the conditions are right, plants are able to develop roots on the stem. Here an example of tomatoes and physalis. I noticed that over the years on many other plants as well. The root growth was enormous that year. I guess you can imagine how much fun it was to clean up the grow beds. Many of the tomatoes I let ripe afterwards in the house, and because we could not eat all of them or we were really tired of eating them, I turned some of them into a nice tomato sauce. And as promised, here are now my learnings of the season. Media-filled beds are not very nice to clean. Breeding fish is fun and teaches you a lot, but you really need space for it and the use for all the offspring. The small tomatoes tasted us way better than the big ones. Efficient mechanical filtration is very important. A solid, fixed bed biofilter works very well. Iron and calcium fertilizer promote plant growth and buffers the pH. The garden needs frequently maintenance, so take care of your plants. During the winter time, I did the course to become an indoor fish farmer and I started my studies of agriculture at the University of Bonn. So this was the second episode of Aquaponics My Story. I hope you liked this episode and that you could learn something from it. If you have any comments or feedback, just post it in the comment section below, and I would be very happy if you leave me a subscription and a like. And yeah, oh, I forgot something. Actually, in the same year where I had this season, I built a second aquaponic system for my school. So I built a school aquaponic system, and there I used quite some different techniques. So what I use there, I'm going to show you in the next episode of Aquaponics My Story. So see you next time.